The Galactic Concordance had been running the universe like a particularly exclusive country club for approximately 3,000 years, give or take a few centuries depending on which calendar system you preferred, and how much you trusted historians who'd been dead longer than most civilizations had existed. It was the sort of institution that prided itself on tradition, decorum, and the unshakable belief that some species were simply more equal than others. A concept they'd managed to dress up in enough diplomatic language to make it sound almost respectable. At the apex of this cosmic food chain sat the hegemonic assembly, a collection of 12 species who'd carved up the galaxy like a particularly large and unruly pizza. The Vorthok controlled military operations with the sort of methodical brutality that made accountants weep tears of joy. The Selenites handled economics through a combination of mathematical precision and what could charitably be called creative interpretation of trade law. The Crystalline Collective managed communications across 17 different dimensions, mostly because they were the only ones masochistic enough to enjoy untangling quantum entanglement bureaucracy. And then there were the humans. According to the official Concordance files, were what polite society might call a recent addition to the galactic community. Less polite society, which included roughly 90% of the galaxy's bar patrons, preferred terms like those upstart primates, or the species that somehow managed to not blow themselves up before achieving faster-than-light travel. Though, honestly, the jury's still out on that one. The human representative stood in the assembly's waiting chamber, a cavernous space designed with all the warmth and personality of a mausoleum that had given up on life. Everything was carved from some sort of crystalline material that probably had a name longer than most shopping lists and cost more than several small planets' gross domestic products. The lighting was that particular shade of blue-white that suggested both technological superiority and a complete disregard for anything resembling comfort. She'd been waiting for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. Which in diplomatic time translated to "We know you're here, we just don't particularly care." The other representatives lounged in their designated areas with the casual arrogance of beings who'd never had to wonder whether their next meal might try to eat them first. The Vorthok delegation looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet and given it delusions of grandeur. The Selenites resembled overgrown butterflies, if butterflies were made of liquid mercury and had developed a taste for compound interest. The human delegation, announced Archon Valdris, the Assembly's current rotating president, a position that changed hands every 50 standard years or whenever someone got tired of dealing with interdimensional tax codes. Valdris belonged to a species that had apparently been designed by committee, a committee with no sense of aesthetic proportion and a disturbing fascination with tentacles. Ow! Quaint. The word quaint hung in the air like a bad smell, which, given the Assembly's atmospheric mixture, wasn't entirely metaphorical. "We've been reviewing your species' application for full membership status," continued Valdris, manipulating what appeared to be a datapad with appendages that defied several laws of physics and at least 2 laws of good taste. "Fascinating reading. Your planet's history is quite colorful." Several delegates made sounds that might have been laughter, if laughter could be weaponized and used to strip paint from spacecraft hulls. "Particularly interesting is your species' approach to conflict resolution," added Councillor Nexith, a crystalline collective representative who looked like someone had taught a chandelier how to feel superior. "So, direct." More sounds that definitely weren't meant to be complimentary. The human representative remained silent, which in diplomatic circles was either a sign of wisdom or a confession of having nothing intelligent to contribute. The smart money was usually on the latter, especially when it came to newer species who hadn't yet learned that galactic politics was less about governing and more about who could insult whom using the most syllables. However, Valdris continued, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver news about as welcome as a tax audit. "The Assembly has decided that humanity requires additional assessment before full membership can be granted." The chamber fell silent except for the ambient humming of various life support systems, each tuned to maintain the precise atmospheric conditions necessary to keep 12 different species from either suffocating, dissolving, or spontaneously combusting. It was the sort of silence that suggested everyone knew something unpleasant was about to happen, like the moment before someone announces that the restaurant is out of everything except the fish that's been sitting under heat lamps since the previous geological era. "Assessment?" the human finally asked, her voice carrying just enough diplomatic neutrality to avoid starting an interstellar incident. but not quite enough to hide a certain underlying weariness that suggested she'd dealt with bureaucratic doublespeak before. "Oh yes," Valdris said, his tone now positively dripping with what passed for benevolence among species that had evolved from apex predators. "A simple survival evaluation. Standard procedure for all prospective members, you understand. Perfectly routine. The fact that no one in the chamber could maintain eye contact or equivalent sensory organ contact suggested that perfectly routine was about as accurate as claiming that black holes were just really enthusiastic vacuum cleaners. The evaluation will take place on Kepler-422c, announced Nexith, consulting what appeared to be a list that had been written in a language that hurt to look at directly. Lovely planet, diverse ecosystem, rich in. Kepler-422c was the sort of planet that appeared in survival manuals under the heading Places to Avoid, unless you've developed a serious death wish and have exhausted all other options. It featured weather patterns that would make meteorologists weep, flora that treated photosynthesis as a side hobby to creative homicide, and fauna that had apparently evolved specifically to make everything else on the planet regret existing. You'll have standard survival equipment, naturally, Valdris added with the sort of generosity that suggested the equipment would be about as useful as a chocolate teapot in a supernova. And of course you'll be monitored throughout the assessment for your own safety. The way he said monitored suggested that the monitoring would be conducted from a safe distance, possibly from orbit, quite possibly from another star system entirely. "How long is this assessment?" the human asked. "Oh, that depends entirely on you," Valdris replied. "The evaluation concludes when you either complete the survival course or—" He paused delicately. "Well, when the evaluation concludes." 20 minutes later, the human representative found herself strapped into what the Concordance generously called an atmospheric entry vehicle, and what anyone with a functioning sense of self-preservation would call a barely controlled plummet toward certain doom. The craft's interior had been designed with all the comfort of a particularly vindictive coffin, complete with restraints that seemed more interested in preventing escape than providing safety. As Kepler-422c grew larger in the viewport, a planet that looked like someone had decided to paint a world using only shades of ominous and probably lethal, the human representative allowed herself a small smile. They thought this was a test of survival. They had no idea what they'd actually started. Kepler-422c welcomed its newest visitor with all the hospitality of a loan shark collecting overdue payment. The atmospheric entry vehicle, which had performed admirably right up until the moment it decided that controlled descent was more of a suggestion than a requirement, now decorated the landscape like abstract art, if abstract art typically involved twisted metal and the lingering smell of fried electronics. The human emerged from the wreckage with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested this wasn't her first unscheduled landing on a hostile world. She surveyed her surroundings with the methodical attention of someone conducting a property inspection, albeit one where the property was actively trying to kill her. The immediate environment could charitably be described as aggressively unwelcoming. Crimson vegetation twisted upward in formations that looked like nature had decided to experiment with Gothic architecture and had developed a serious anger management problem. The trees, if trees was the right word for plant life that appeared to be made of equal parts chlorophyll and barely contained rage, leaned inward with an almost predatory interest. The air itself seemed thick with the sort of humidity that suggested the planet's weather patterns had been designed by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor and access to industrial-grade atmospheric process. Meanwhile, approximately 300 kilometers above the surface, the hegemonic Assembly's observation ship Inevitable Bureaucracy maintained its monitoring position with all the enthusiasm of tax collectors watching a particularly promising audit. "Initial survival probability assessment," inquired Valdris, settling into his observation throne with the satisfied air of someone about to watch entertainment that had been specifically designed for his amusement. 17% chance of surviving the first planetary rotation, reported tactician Zurus, a Vorthak whose idea of optimism was calculating casualty rates to only 3 decimal places, assuming no encounters with indigenous predator species. With encounter, he paused to consult his instruments. 4%, possibly lower if she encounters a shadow maw. "Shadow maw?" asked Counselor Nexith. her crystalline form refracting the ship's lighting into patterns that suggested mild interest and considerable schadenfreude. Apex predator, roughly 12 meters of muscle, teeth, and what our xenobiologists generously classify as creative aggression. Zurus explained with professional pride. They hunt by scent and can track prey across continental distances. Particularly fond of unfamiliar protein sources. Delightful, Valdris murmured, activating the betting interface that had become a standard feature of these evaluations. I'll take 20,000 credits on consumed by local wildlife within 6 standard hours. 40,000 on exposure and dehydration. Countered Nexit. These warm-blooded species are remarkably fragile when removed from their climate-controlled environment. Down on the planet's surface, the subject of their wagering was conducting what appeared to be an inventory of her survival kit, with the sort of thorough attention that suggested she actually read instruction manual. The Concordance had provided her with equipment that met the minimum requirements for survival assistance, while carefully avoiding anything that might actually be useful. A water purification tablet that would purify exactly 1 liter of water before dissolving into component atoms. A nutrition bar that contained all the essential amino acids, assuming the consumer's definition of essential was remarkably flexible. A communications device that could theoretically contact the monitoring ship, provided atmospheric conditions were perfect, solar interference was minimal, and the device's battery hadn't been manufactured by the lowest bidder. The human examined each item with the sort of methodical attention that made Zurus frown at his monitoring equipment. Most species at this point would either be panicking about their imminent doom, or attempting to establish some sort of shelter. This one was planning. Curious, Zurus muttered, adjusting his sensors. Subject appears to be conducting tactical assessment, rather than basic survival preparation. Probably doesn't understand the gravity of her situation, suggested Valdris. These newer species often lack proper threat assessment capability. This analysis might have been more convincing if the human hadn't chosen that exact moment to begin systematically dismantling her communication device with the sort of precision that suggested advanced technical knowledge and possibly engineering background that hadn't appeared in her diplomatic files. What is she doing? Nexith asked, her voice taking on a tone that suggested crystalline confusion. Appears to be weaponizing her emergency beacon, Zurus reported, his professional pride in accurate threat assessment beginning to compete with a growing sense of unease. The human had indeed converted her communications equipment into something that bore a disturbing resemblance to an improvised explosive device, though one with considerably more sophistication than the term improvised typically suggested. She was now in the process of creating what appeared to be additional tools from the wreckage of her landing craft, displaying a level of mechanical ingenuity that was making several observers quietly revise their survival probability calculation. Resourceful, admitted Valdris, though his tone suggested this wasn't necessarily a positive development from his perspective. The first test of her resourcefulness came approximately 37 minutes after landing, when the local ecosystem decided to conduct its own evaluation of the new arrival. The shadow maw that emerged from the twisted vegetation was indeed 12 meters of evolutionary malice, moving with the sort of fluid grace that suggested it had been designed specifically for the purpose of making other living things stop being living things as efficiently as possible. Excellent, breathed Valdris. Now we'll see how long human reflexes last against a proper apex predator. The human looked up at the approaching shadow maw with the sort of calm attention she might have given to a mildly interesting geological formation. Then she smiled. It was not, the observers noted with growing alarm, the sort of smile typically associated with terror, resignation, or any of the other emotional responses they'd expected from a creature about to become someone else's lunch. It was the sort of smile that suggested she'd been hoping something exactly like this would show up. The shadow maw pounced with 12 meters of evolutionary confidence. The human stepped aside with the sort of casual efficiency that made the creature's landing look embarrassingly clumsy, simultaneously activating her improvised device and introducing the apex predator to the concept of high-explosive surprise party.
The resulting explosion painted the immediate area with what had recently been Kepler 442c's most feared predator, while the human calmly collected several specific organic samples from the remains. Revise survival probability estimates, Valdris ordered quietly. Revising, Xerxes replied, his tone suggesting that his calculations had just encountered several mathematical concepts that weren't supposed to exist outside of theoretical physics. New assessment. Uncertain. On the planet's surface, the human finished her sample collection and looked up at the sky with the sort of direct attention that suggested she knew exactly where the monitoring ship was positioned. Then she waved.
The wave was the sort of gesture that managed to convey several messages simultaneously: acknowledgement of surveillance, casual dismissal of concern, and what experienced military analysts would recognize as a declaration of intent, wrapped in polite social convention. It was the diplomatic equivalent of loading a weapon while maintaining eye contact. Aboard the inevitable bureaucracy, the observation crew experienced what psychologists might classify as collective cognitive dissonance. Assuming psychologists had ever studied the mental state of superior alien species, watching their carefully planned superiority demonstration go sideways in real time. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Nexith with the sort of forced calm that preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown, we should consider deploying additional assessment parameters. Additional parameters? Valdris inquired, though his tone suggested he already knew he wasn't going to enjoy the answer. The grinding hordes, Sarius announced with professional enthusiasm, apparently having decided that if their survival assessment was going to become complicated, it might as well become catastrophically complicated. Indigenous pack hunters, roughly humanoid, but with significantly improved dentition and a cultural approach to conflict resolution that makes Vorthak military doctrine look like a philosophical discussion. Deploy them, Valdris ordered, activating what was either a tactical interface or the galaxy's most expensive video game console. Down on the planet's surface, the human had spent the intervening time constructing what appeared to be either an elaborate shelter or a moderately sophisticated fortress, depending on one's definition of shelter and whether one believed shelters typically included firing positions and what looked suspiciously like automated defense systems constructed from salvaged landing craft components. Resourceful had been upgraded to concern. The grinding hordes approached her position with the sort of coordinated movement that suggested they'd attended the same tactical academy as several successful military campaigns. They moved in formation, communicated through subsonic vocalizations, and displayed the sort of strategic thinking that made most species military advisors request hazard pay. The human watched their approach through what appeared to be an improvised periscope system and made several adjustments to her defensive preparations, with the casual efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this sort of thing before, possibly as a hobby. Interesting tactical deployment, she said aloud, apparently addressing her comments to the monitoring equipment she'd identified with disturbing accuracy. Classic pincer movement with reserve forces. Textbook approach, assuming your enemy is operating within standard defensive parameters. The first wave of grinding hordes hit her outer perimeter and discovered that standard defensive parameters was not an accurate description of her preparation methodology. The improvised mines she'd constructed from her nutrition bars, apparently the Concordance's emergency rations contained more explosive compounds than advertised, introduced the attacking force to the concept of surprise parties, where the surprise was significantly more lethal than typical party entertainment. Tactical assessment, Valdris demanded, his voice taking on the sort of strained quality that suggested his worldview was undergoing unscheduled maintenance. Subject appears to have anticipated standard assault patterns, Saris reported with professional bewilderment. Current defensive strategy suggests advanced military training and possibly combat experience against numerically superior forces. The human's voice carried clearly through the monitoring equipment. Phase 2. Psychological warfare. Standard counterinsurgency doctrine adapted for indigenous hostile species. What followed could only be described as educational, assuming one's educational interests included advanced courses in creative applications of battlefield psychology and how to make apex predators reconsider their life choices. The human had apparently spent her preparation time studying the grinding hordes' social structure through observation of their approach patterns, and had concluded that their pack mentality included several exploitable weaknesses. Her next tactical innovation involved broadcasting subsonic frequencies that mimicked their distress calls, while simultaneously deploying what appeared to be chemical markers, designed to trigger territorial aggression responses. The result was roughly 60% of the attacking force suddenly deciding that their primary enemy wasn't the fortified human position, but rather each other, leading to what military historians would probably classify as catastrophic tactical dissolution due to induced friendly fire incidents. This is unprecedented, Nexic observed, her crystalline structure flickering in patterns that suggested she was either impressed or experiencing the equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Deploy the Void Hunters, Valdris ordered with the sort of desperate determination that characterized leaders, whose carefully planned strategies had encountered reality and lost the encounter badly. Void Hunters were the sort of creature that appeared in xenobiology textbooks, under the heading, Reasons Why Some Planets Should Remain Uninhabited. They existed in a quantum superposition between dimensions, making them effectively invisible until the moment they decided to make something stop existing, at which point they became remarkably visible and extremely committed to their chosen task. Void Hunters deployed, Ceres announced. Probability of target survival now approaching mathematical impossibility. The human, meanwhile, had apparently been expecting this escalation and was in the process of making final adjustments to what could only be described as a dimensional resonance array constructed from her water purification tablets and the metallic components of her destroyed communication equipment. Fascinating, she said conversationally, apparently still addressing the monitoring crew. Void Hunters operate through quantum dimensional shifting. Clever. Unfortunately for your tactical assessment, dimensional physics includes several convenient loopholes when you understand the underlying mathematical principles. She activated her improvised array just as the first Void Hunter materialized within her defensive perimeter. What happened next violated several laws of physics, and at least two fundamental principles of reality. The dimensional resonance cascade she'd created didn't just neutralize the Void Hunter, it created a localized space-time distortion that effectively turned the creature's own dimensional shifting abilities against it, trapping it in a quantum loop that would keep it permanently attempting to exist and not exist simultaneously. Impossible, Ceres whispered. Improbable, the human corrected, her voice now carrying clearly through what should have been secure communication channels, suggesting she'd somehow accessed their monitoring network. But not impossible if you understand that quantum mechanics is just engineering with a more complicated. Aboard the observation ship, emergency alarms began sounding with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested the ship's AI had concluded that the current situation fell well outside normal operational parameters. She's accessing our systems, Nexic reported with the sort of calm that preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. How? Valdris demanded. Unknown. Our security protocols were designed to prevent access by any known species. The human's voice now filled the observation ship's bridge with unsettling clarity. The thing about security protocols designed to prevent access by known species is that they tend to have some rather obvious blind spots when it comes to species you've underestimated. The tactical displays that had been showing the planet's surface now displayed something else entirely, detailed schematics of the inevitable bureaucracy itself, complete with structural weak points, crew disposition, and what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of the ship's defensive capabilities. Shall we discuss the terms of my survival assessment? The human asked politely, because I believe we need to establish some new parameters for this evaluation. The silence aboard the inevitable bureaucracy was the sort that typically preceded either profound philosophical revelations or spectacular military disasters. In this particular case, the smart money was heavily favoring the latter, especially considering that their supposedly primitive evaluation subject had just demonstrated the ability to hack their quantum encrypted communication systems, using improvised equipment constructed from emergency rations and scrap metal. This is impossible, Valdris repeated, apparently having decided that if he said it enough times, reality might eventually agree with him. No species achieves this level of technological sophistication without centuries of guided development and proper institutional oversight. The human's voice replied through their communication systems with the sort of conversational tone one might use to explain why the weather was particularly nice. That's your first mistake. You're assuming technological sophistication,
requires institutional oversight. Human development tends to follow a more organic approach. She paused, and the monitoring equipment registered what appeared to be construction activity around her position. Whatever she was building now, it was significantly more complex than her previous improvised fortification. Your second mistake, she continued, was assuming this was a survival assessment. Of course it's a survival assessment. Nexaith interjected, her crystalline form flickering in patterns that suggested either indignation or the early stages of systemic failure. Standard protocol for all prospective member species. Standard protocol, the human repeated thoughtfully. How many species have you subjected to this standard protocol over the past, say, 1,000 years? The question hung in the air like a mathematical proof that nobody wanted to solve. Because according to your own records, which incidentally, have surprisingly inadequate security protocols, this survival assessment has been administered to exactly 47 species over the past millennium. Current hegemonic assembly membership, 12 species, which suggests that 35 species failed to meet your survival standards. More silence, this time with the added texture of growing unease. Curious survival rate, the human observed, almost as if the assessment was designed to produce a specific outcome, rather than evaluate actual capability. On the planet's surface, her construction project was nearing completion. The monitoring systems were having difficulty analyzing exactly what she'd built, partly because it incorporated technologies that shouldn't have been possible with her available materials, and partly because it appeared to be actively interfering with their sensor arrays in ways that made their quantum physicists request stress leave. The thing is, the human continued, apparently multitasking between philosophical discourse and advanced engineering, humans have a peculiar approach to problem solving. When faced with a test designed to measure our ability to survive, we tend to ask ourselves, why are we being tested in the first place? She paused again, and the construction sound stopped. And the answer in this case is rather illuminating. You're not testing survival capability, you're eliminating potential competition before it can threaten your established power structure. The tactical displays aboard the observation ship began showing something that made Xerxes' professional military training compete directly with his survival instincts. The human's construction project appeared to be a communications array powerful enough to broadcast across multiple star systems simultaneously. However, the human said, her tone shifting to something that might have been described as businesslike, if business typically involved existential threats to galactic political stability. You've made a fundamental miscalculation about human psychology. The communications array activated. What followed was the sort of information cascade that made historians request hazard pay and political scientists update their resume. The human had spent her time on Kepler 442c doing considerably more than just surviving. She'd been conducting a comprehensive analysis of the hegemonic assembly's entire operational structure, using their own monitoring equipment to access databases that were supposed to be secured behind quantum encryption and several layers of dimensional firewalls. And now she was broadcasting her findings to every inhabited system within 50 light-years. Details of your survival assessments, she announced, apparently addressing the galaxy at large. Complete records of species elimination protocols, financial records showing betting pools on assessment outcome, and my personal favorite, internal communications, discussing the most efficient methods for preventing undesirable species from achieving advanced development. The communication networks throughout the local galactic sector began experiencing what technical specialists would classify as catastrophic information overload. Though in this case the overload was entirely intentional and specifically designed to ensure maximum distribution of politically inconvenient data. You've just committed an act of galactic terrorism, Valdris declared with the sort of moral indignation that typically preceded either surrender or escalation to more desperate measures. Terrorism, the human repeated thoughtfully. Interesting choice of terminology. I'd have called it public education, or possibly transparency in government, but I suppose it depends on your perspective. The tactical displays were now showing something that made even Xerxes reconsider his career choices. Response fleets from 37 different star systems, all converging on their current position, with what appeared to be less than diplomatic intention. "Oh," the human added conversationally, "and I should mention that I've also been broadcasting detailed tactical analysis of your military capabilities, complete with strategic weak points and recommended countermeasures." Professional courtesy, really. It seemed unfair to let them attack without proper intelligence. The inevitable bureaucracy found itself facing the galaxy's first instance of crowdsourced military action, as dozens of species that had never spoken to each other began coordinating attacks on their common oppressor, with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for holiday celebrations and sporting events. "This is madness," Nexiath observed, apparently having reached the stage of psychological processing, where acceptance was beginning to compete with denial. "This is revolution," the human corrected. "Though I admit the distinction can sometimes be subtle." The first wave of attacking ships reached engagement range, approximately 17 minutes later, at which point the crew of the inevitable bureaucracy learned that their supposedly overwhelming technological superiority became significantly less overwhelming when 37 different species were sharing detailed information about their defensive systems' exploitable vulnerability. The battle lasted approximately 43 minutes, and could be charitably described as educationally one-sided. When the shooting stopped, the human's voice filled the communication channels of every surviving ship in the system. "Now then, shall we discuss the terms of my survival assessment?" 3 weeks later, the former hegemonic assembly building had been converted into what was diplomatically described as a galactic coordination center, though most observers noted that it bore a strong resemblance to a military command structure, with the human representative occupying what had previously been Valdris's executive suite. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They'd designed a test to ensure that dangerous species were eliminated before they could threaten the established order. Instead, they'd accidentally created the perfect recruitment exam for someone capable of overthrowing that established order entirely. And now, in a development that would have been hilarious if it hadn't been quite so terrifying, the galaxy's former rulers found themselves lining up to request approval for their own survival assessments, this time administered by the species they'd tried to eliminate. The human representative, settling into her new role as the galaxy's unofficial coordinator of existential evaluations, couldn't help but appreciate the poetic justice of the situation. Her mission had indeed been to survive, but winning the whole damn war had turned out to be considerably more efficient.